The death of US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has sparked a partisan and corrosive debate as to the appointment and confirmation of her successor. The naming of Donald Trump's nominee for the position today has merely intensified that argument.
Today it is my honour to nominate one of our nation's most brilliant and gifted legal minds to the Supreme Court. She is a woman of unparalleled achievement, towering intellect, sterling credentials, and unyielding loyalty to the Constitution, Judge Amy Coney Barrett.
We are fortunate in this country that our judicial system bears more of the hallmarks of our English common law origins than elements of the American system, though our founding fathers did intentionally import the doctrine of separation of powers into the text and structure of our Constitution. Few Australians could name a single justice of our High Court, and that's probably a good thing. Judicial activism and the cult of personality have no place in the strict legalism that we should expect from our paramount court. So I doubt anyone outside elite legal circles would be aware that 2 justices of our High Court will reach their mandatory retiring age within the next 6 months. This has been a ghastly year for every element of our way of life, but none more so than for the fundamental principles of our federal compact and the individual liberties of our subjects. Last week there was uproar over an emergency bill drafted by the Andrews government. Border closures, arguably in contravention of sections 92 and 117 of the Constitution, have been tacitly condoned by the Commonwealth. While some of these are matters for arcane legal dispute, many of the quiet Australians intuitively know that something is amiss. The Prime Minister and his Attorney-General Christian Porter face a very serious test in the next few months. Will they appoint strict legalists or capital C Conservatives to the High Court? I, for one, certainly hope so, and so do many in the coalition ranks. If you thought the ructions over energy policy were nasty, wait for the manoeuvring over the replacement for Justices Nettle and Bell. Well, Campbell, you're in one of the states that was almost subject of High Court litigation over Section 92, Queensland, and you've been in the executive role. What do you make of it? Have you had any murmurs about who might be in the front row to be appointed to the High Court from amongst the leading silks or judges of the country?
No, Catherine, I certainly haven't. I certainly don't move in legal circles. But it's interesting what you've put forward this evening about whether there'll be some sort of stoush, and I think that is quite a topic at the current time, given that we tend to sort of follow what's happened in the United States. You know, I had some battles with a certain appointment to the Supreme Court in Queensland, and that was highly political, and that shows you where things could go in Australia, because frankly the left in the legal fraternity in Queensland did decide they didn't want the Chief Justice that I appointed, and ultimately, as the record would show, bullied him and through his wife out of the position. A very sad day. So anyone who thinks this can't happen in Australia, the sort of terrible things that we've seen in the United States over, say, Judge Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court in the US, anyone who thinks it can't happen here, well, it can happen, and it has happened in the Queensland criminal justice system.
Indeed.
So I certainly, I certainly hope that we don't see that go for the High Court.
Sarah, what do you make of all this? Have you been following the potential retirements of these justices? I know they're not household names by any means, but is it an issue that's exercised your mind?
Catherine, I have to admit that it hasn't, and it's probably troubling, isn't it, that as an Australian I've been much more engaged with what's been happening in the Supreme Court. I think it's such a fascinating topic that you've raised tonight, and I have to admit that I hadn't given it a great deal of thought. And as you say, if it would be terrible if it played out in that same polarising way. I think it's been such a self-defeating debate in the US, hasn't it? Not just now, of course, as we see this scuffle about what happens over the next 2 months, but we've seen it because this would be the third justice that I understand Donald Trump's been able to appoint to the Supreme Court. So you can see why it's red rag to a bull to his political foes.
Sure.
And of course, the most likely nominee is 48. So he's been very smart, hasn't he? In that,
by the way, I think she's a terrific potential justice, frankly. But Corey, you're very familiar with the Conservative wing of the coalition, and you must be hearing some rumblings from some of your former colleagues about freedom of religion and other tests that they feel that the Prime Minister and Christian Porter have not really stepped up on. You got any thoughts on whether there'll be a capital C Conservative make the cut this time, or have you got any nominees whose case you'd be willing to put?
Gee, what a broad question, Catherine. I have to say I am a bit of a nerd like you, clearly, because I've thought, who are they going to replace these two imminently retiring justices with? Because there are a lot of things that they've got to be dealing with, the court. And I haven't really worried about the composition of the High Court previously until, remember, they made that judgment about people that had never lived here, that had a drop or two of Aboriginal blood in them, and suddenly they were allowed to come back. And that's when I realised how we've become a little bit activist, and I don't think that's absolutely appropriate in this country.
Indeed. In fact, our second program, Corey, as I recall, I think I raised that very case at the time, and that gave me great concern. And I know there are some folks from the coalition parties, Amanda Stoker, who's a former associate to Justice Callanan, and Senator Abetz and others have had a view that there has to be a line drawn on this. So I think this is going to be a bit like the politics of energy within the coalition. Campbell?
Catherine, can I just say, I don't go with you there. I don't go with you there because I think in the end a choice will be made. It'll be vetted internally and it will be appointed. The only reason we'll have an outcry, like they've had about Kavanaugh or like they're having confected one about the latest appointment proposal in America, is if the left decide to make up lies. And that's what they do extraordinarily well. They're repeated verbatim by the grubs on Twitter and the brain-dead media, and they destroy people's lives for some sort of partisan political point.
Were you in the government at any time when discussions were had about appointments? I think George Brandis and certainly Philip Ruddock might have made appointments at to the High Court.
Look, I can tell you, I would be the last person that George Brandis consulted about anything, Catherine. I can assure you of that. But
you're starting to sound like a Premier of Victoria, mate. You weren't in the room when they had the debate.
I wasn't in the room, mate. I was in a room by myself. So
okay.
There you go. But Campbell might have been in the room.
Yeah. Well,
I think at least it's not as mission critical in Australia because, as we know, the United States system and their constitution has a lot of esoteric language that is then needed to be interpreted. So the court, there was a very interesting piece in the Weekend Australian about this. The court has actually become a sort of another level of political government there to be the final arbiter on some of these rather ambiguous sort of things in the Constitution.
Indeed.
We don't seem to have quite the same problem, but again, I think we can see the same sort of partisan political games being played out on appointments in the future.
We don't have a Bill of Rights, of course, which is often what is contentious. And I guess Janet Ulrichsen made that point very well. She's a terrific writer on legal affairs about the fact that one of the reasons abortion, for instance, is not quite as divisive along party lines in Australia is the fact that the Supreme Court has not had to interpret bills of rights and so on. Sarah, what's your feeling? You said you haven't followed this in a geek sense, and I totally get it. My point about it being an esoteric topic, I think it's a healthy thing for Australia. I don't think having personality judges and charismatic kind of dissenters on the court does Australia any good.
I completely concur with you, Catherine. I think when you said that we really need legalist appointments, that most Australians, as you say, quiet Australians or a few noisy ones, would actually be full agreement there. I don't think there's any appetite to see another layer of government here. If you want to have an activist role, if you want to agitate for change, if you want to play a legislative role, I think there's an expectation that you run for office.
I couldn't agree more.
If we're relying on your legal expertise, then you are there to interpret the Constitution and to weigh through matters that have reach the highest court in the land. And I don't think that we're looking for any sort of personality politics or any personal agenda.
And look, at whatever one thinks about her crusading and so on, I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg did cross a line in the 2016 election. Corey, any final thoughts from you on this topic? I know it's I've thrown a dead cat about that aliens decision, but is there anyone on your radar that you'd recommend as a capital C Conservative? Tim Fischer certainly had a view when Ian Callanan was appointed.
Yeah, no one in particular, Catherine, but, a couple of the points that you raised in your editorial, it's up to people to actually take a case to the High Court. It's not for the High Court to jump in and say, we're going to rule on this. The problem is no one did it. But anyway, there's so many other issues that we've got to go on with.